"You didn't lose your company, Corvin. You lost your way. Now get it back." Those words hit Corvin's slate like a freight train at full speed. 7 days earlier, he was the untouchable CEO of Hexa Labs, commanding a tech empire, worth $42 million from his corner office in Seattle's Columbia Center. He had the investor meetings, the revenue projections, and the kind of arrogance that comes from never being challenged. Now he sat in a small cafe on Pine Street, staring into the calm brown eyes of the woman whose life he'd destroyed with a single decision. The woman who, instead of seeking revenge, had just offered him the most profound truth he'd ever heard. Corvin Slate was a man who measured everything. His morning protein shake contained exactly 28 grams of whey. His Tesla took the most efficient route to work, saving him 4 minutes and 37 seconds daily. His company occupied 3 floors of premium Seattle real estate, and every square foot was optimized for maximum productivity. At 35, he'd built Hexa Labs from a college dorm room concept into a tech company that had Silicon Valley venture capitalists calling twice a week. The company's flagship product, FlowSync, was revolutionizing how Fortune 500 companies managed complex projects. Corvin wasn't just successful, he was the kind of successful that made other entrepreneurs study his methods. But success had made him dangerous, not to his competitors, not to his market share, but to the very people who made his success possible. Corvin had developed what he called data-driven leadership, which was really just a fancy way of saying he'd forgotten that numbers on spreadsheets represented real human beings with real lives, real dreams, and real feelings. He hired the best talent money could buy, paid them competitive salaries, and expected results. Personal problems stayed at home. Office drama was eliminated before it started. If you couldn't perform at the highest level consistently, you were replaced. It was nothing personal, just business. This philosophy had never failed him. His employee turnover was below industry average, his profit margins were exceptional, and his company culture was described by business magazines as refreshingly drama-free. Corvin believed he'd cracked the code on modern leadership. He was wrong. The woman sitting across from him in that cafe was Alira May, 28 years old, former UI lead at Hexa Labs, and the person whose wrongful termination had just triggered the most spectacular corporate meltdown Seattle's tech scene had witnessed in years. She wasn't supposed to matter in Corvin's carefully calculated world. She was quiet, kept to herself, delivered exceptional work without fanfare. Before we go any further, I'd like to extend a special shout-out to Diane, our first ever commenter. Your support is appreciated, as with every one of my lovely viewers. Take a moment to tell me where you're watching from and what the time is. Please enjoy today's video. Alira was the kind of employee who brought homemade soup when colleagues worked late during flu season. She fixed the office coffee machine without being asked, and once spent her lunch break helping Corvin's 6-year-old niece find her way back to the family day event. She was background music in Corvin's symphony of efficiency, present, valuable, but largely unnoticed. Until he fired her. What started as a 30-second decision made in a moment of panic became a 7-day masterclass in how quickly pride can destroy everything you've built. Corvin learned the hard way that the quiet ones aren't invisible. They're often the foundation holding everything together. Remove the foundation, and even the strongest structures collapse. But this isn't just a story about corporate failure. It's about what happens when a man who spent his entire career avoiding emotional connections suddenly discovers that the most important business metric isn't profit or productivity. It's the human cost of your decisions. It's about how love can grow in the spaces between words, in small acts of kindness that go unnoticed, in the way someone's absence can teach you more about their value than their presence ever did. It's about the difference between commanding respect and earning it, between being feared and being trusted, between running a company and actually leading people. Most importantly, it's about redemption. Not the Hollywood kind where everything gets fixed with a grand gesture, but the real kind that requires you to look in the mirror, acknowledge the damage you've caused, and do the hard work of becoming someone worthy of a second chance. Corvin Slate thought he understood power. He thought success meant never having to say you're sorry, never showing weakness, never admitting mistakes. He was about to learn that real power comes from vulnerability, that true strength is found in humility, and that the most successful leaders are those brave enough to let others see their humanity. The week that changed everything started with a product launch that should have been Corvin's greatest triumph. Instead, it became the catalyst for a collapse that would strip away everything he thought he knew about business, about leadership, and about himself. Let me take you back to where it all began, to the moment when Corvin, Slate's perfectly controlled world, started cracking at its foundation. The 34th floor of Seattle's Columbia Center housed more than just Hexa Labs. It contained Corvin Slate's vision of perfect corporate efficiency. Every morning at 6:47 a.m., he stepped out of the elevator into a world he designed to eliminate chaos, emotion, and unpredictability. Glass walls separated departments while maintaining visual connectivity. Ergonomic workstations were positioned to maximize natural light and minimize distractions. Even the office plants were selected based on their air-purifying properties and low-maintenance requirements. Corvin's corner office reflected his personality: minimalist, functional, intimidating. A single monitor displayed real-time company metrics. His desk held only 3 items: a laptop, a water bottle, and a framed photo of the day Hexa Labs received its first $1 million contract. No personal mementos, no family photos, no evidence that Corvin Slate existed outside these walls. Hexa Labs employed 63 people across 3 floors, each hired through Corvin's rigorous screening process. Technical skills were mandatory, but cultural fit was equally important. He wanted team players who understood that excellence wasn't negotiable, deadlines weren't suggestions, and personal drama had no place in professional environments. The company's flagship product, FlowSync, was gaining serious traction in the enterprise market. Major corporations were abandoning legacy project management systems in favor of Corvin's streamlined platform. The software integrated seamlessly with existing workflows while providing unprecedented visibility into project timelines, resource allocation, and team productivity. It was elegant, powerful, and profitable. But if Corvin was the architect of Hexa Labs' success, Elira May was quietly becoming its soul. She worked at desk 23B on the 32nd floor, positioned near floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Elliott Bay. Her workspace was organized but personal, dual monitors displaying wireframes and color palettes, a small, succulent named Gerald, and a coffee mug with faded text reading "Design it with heart, or not at all." The mug was a gift from her previous job, a reminder of values she refused to compromise. Elira had joined Hexa Labs 18 months ago as a senior UI/UX designer, but her influence extended far beyond her official role. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand user behavior, to anticipate needs before they were articulated, to transform complex functionality into intuitive experiences. While other designers chased trends and flashy animations, Elira focused on solving real problems. Her redesign of FlowSync's dashboard had increased user engagement by 37%. Her streamlined onboarding process reduced customer support tickets by half. Her attention to accessibility features had opened new market segments Corvin hadn't even considered. The sales team adored her because clients consistently praised the platform's ease of use. The development team respected her because her designs were technically feasible and well documented. The customer success team relied on her because she understood how real people actually used software in high-pressure environments. But Elira's true gift wasn't technical, it was human. She remembered that Marcus, the junior developer, was struggling with anxiety about his first major project. So she spent lunch breaks walking him through complex problems until his confidence returned. When Sarah from accounting mentioned her daughter's college tuition stress, Elira quietly researched scholarship opportunities and left printed applications on her desk. During the brutal 3-week crunch before the last product release, she brought homemade cookies and stayed late to help overwhelmed colleagues meet impossible deadlines. These weren't calculated moves designed to advance her career. Elira simply believed that work should be more than just a paycheck, that teams functioned better when people actually cared about each other, that small kindnesses could transform entire workplace cultures. Corvin noticed her professional output, but remained blind to her human impact. To him, Elira was a high-performing asset who consistently delivered quality work on schedule. He'd approved her salary increases and nodded approvingly during quarterly reviews, but he'd never actually engaged with her as a person. She was part of the background efficiency that made his company run smoothly. What Corvin missed were the countless moments that revealed Alira's true value. How she diplomatically handled difficult clients who demanded impossible changes without losing her temper or compromising the product vision. How she mentored new hires, reducing their learning curve and increasing retention rates. How she'd quietly redesigned internal processes that saved the company thousands of hours annually. She kept a notebook filled with user feedback, competitor analysis, and improvement ideas. While others focused on their immediate tasks, Alira was constantly thinking about how to make FlowSync better, more accessible, more valuable to the people who depended on it daily. Her colleagues sought her opinion on everything from technical decisions to personal dilemmas. She had a gift for listening without judgment, for asking the right questions, for helping people find their own solutions. The office felt different when she was there, calmer, more collaborative, more human. Alira's design philosophy centered on empathy. She spent hours studying user behavior, conducting informal interviews with clients, and testing interfaces with people who had different abilities and technical backgrounds. Her work wasn't just aesthetically pleasing, it was inclusive, intuitive, and genuinely helpful. She'd grown up in a small town outside Portland, the daughter of a librarian and a high school math teacher. Her parents had taught her that success meant making other people's lives better, that true leadership was about service, not power. These values shaped everything she did at Hexa Labs, even when they went unrecognized. The irony was profound. While Corvin prided himself on data-driven decision-making, he'd completely overlooked the most important metric of all, the human element that held his company together. Alira wasn't just designing interfaces, she was designing culture, building bridges between departments, creating the kind of workplace where people wanted to contribute their best work. She never sought credit for her contributions beyond her official responsibilities. When the company newsletter featured success stories, Alira made sure her teammates were highlighted. When clients praised the user experience, she directed attention to the developers who implemented her designs. When industry publications wanted to interview Hexa Labs' design team, she recommended colleagues who deserved recognition. This selflessness wasn't weakness, it was strength. Alira understood that sustainable success required lifting others up, that the best leaders were often the ones who led quietly, by example, without needing titles or recognition to validate their worth. As Hexa Labs prepared for its most ambitious product launch yet, Corvin was focused on investor presentations, market penetration strategies, and revenue projections. He had no idea that his company's continued success depended as much on the quiet woman by the window as it did on his carefully calculated business plans. The stage was set for a collision between two worldviews: Corvin's belief that business was about numbers and efficiency, and Alira's understanding that sustainable success required genuine human connection. Neither of them knew that within days, this philosophical difference would determine the fate of everything they'd both worked to build. The morning of March 15th started like any other at Hexa Labs, but by noon, it would become the day that changed everything. Corvin arrived at 6:30 a.m., 2 hours before the scheduled investor presentation that would determine the company's future. FlowSync 3 was ready for its grand debut, or so everyone believed. The conference room on the 34th floor had been transformed into a high-tech showcase. 3 massive monitors displayed the new interface, while tablets loaded. With the beta version sat at each seat around the polished mahogany table. Corvin had rehearsed his presentation 17 times, timing each segment to maximize impact. The numbers were compelling: projected revenue increases of 340%, market expansion into 3 new sectors, and user-base growth that would triple within 18 months. At 8:15 a.m., the investors began arriving. Margaret Chen from Cascade Ventures, known for her surgical precision in evaluating tech startups. David Rodriguez from Summit Capital, who'd made his fortune backing companies before they became household names. Jennifer Walsh from Pacific Northwest Ventures, whose portfolio included 2 unicorn companies. These weren't just investors, they were kingmakers who could transform Hexa Labs from a regional success story into a national powerhouse. Corvin greeted each investor personally, his confidence radiating through every handshake and smile. He'd spent months preparing for this moment, analyzing market data, refining financial projections, and crafting a narrative that positioned Hexa Labs as the inevitable leader in enterprise project management software. Ladies and gentlemen, Corvin began at exactly 9 a.m. What you're about to see will revolutionize how Fortune 500 companies manage complex projects. The presentation started flawlessly. Corvin walked through FlowSync's evolution, highlighting user growth metrics, customer retention rates, and revenue trends that painted a picture of unstoppable momentum. The investors leaned forward, engaged and impressed by the company's trajectory. Now Corvin announced with theatrical flair, "Let me show you FlowSync 3 in action." He clicked to launch the live demonstration, the moment he'd been building toward for months. The interface should have loaded smoothly, displaying the sleek new dashboard that Alira's team had spent countless hours perfecting. Instead, the screen flickered once, twice, then displayed an error message that made Corvin's blood run cold. System error, 404, database connection failed. A murmur rippled through the room. Corvin's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered, clicking refresh with practiced calm. "Just a minor connectivity issue," he said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. The error persisted. Margaret Chen glanced at her watch. David Rodriguez shifted in his seat. Jennifer Walsh's expression remained neutral, but Corvin could see the skepticism creeping into her eyes. These investors had seen countless presentations, and they knew the difference between minor technical hiccups and fundamental problems. "Let me try a different approach," Corvin said, switching to a backup tablet. The same error appeared, mocking him with its persistence. Behind the scenes, chaos was erupting. Through the glass walls, Corvin could see his development team frantically typing, their faces illuminated by screens filled with error logs and diagnostic tools. Marcus, the junior developer, was practically hyperventilating as he tried to identify the source of the failure. "Perhaps we could review the technical specifications while your team resolves this," suggested Margaret Chen, her tone diplomatically neutral but clearly unimpressed. Corvin nodded, launching into a detailed explanation of FlowSync's architecture, but he could feel the energy draining from the room. Investors didn't just evaluate products, they evaluated leadership, crisis management, and the ability to deliver under pressure. Every minute the system remained down was another nail in the coffin of his funding dreams. 23 minutes passed. 23 excruciating minutes of technical explanations, awkward small talk, and increasingly pointed questions about system reliability and quality assurance processes. The investors' initial enthusiasm had evaporated, replaced by the kind of professional skepticism that killed deals before they started. Finally, the system came back online, but the damage was done. The demonstration proceeded, showcasing FlowSync's impressive features and intuitive design, but the magic was gone. What should have been a triumphant moment felt like damage control. "The interface is certainly elegant," Jennifer Walsh commented, her praise feeling more like a consolation prize than genuine enthusiasm. "User experience is clearly a priority," added David Rodriguez, but his tone suggested he was already mentally moving on to his next meeting. Margaret Chen asked pointed questions about system stability, backup protocols, and disaster recovery procedures. Each question felt like an indictment of Hexa Labs' preparedness for enterprise-level deployment. The presentation concluded at 10:47 a.m., 47 minutes later than scheduled. The investors thanked Corvin politely, promised to be in touch soon, and filed out with the kind of measured politeness that every entrepreneur learns to dread. As the conference room emptied, Corvin stood alone among the tablets and presentation materials, watching his carefully constructed future crumble. The numbers on his projections hadn't changed, but numbers meant nothing if investors couldn't trust the product to work when it mattered most. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Chen. "Thank you for the presentation. We'll need to see more stability before moving forward." David Rodriguez's message was more direct, impressive vision, but execution concerns. "Let's revisit in 6 months." Jennifer Walsh didn't text at all. Corvin walked to his office, closed the door, and stared out at the Seattle skyline. $42 million in company valuation had just evaporated in less than an hour. The funding round he'd been counting on to fuel expansion was dead. The IPO timeline he'd shared with the board was now a fantasy. But the financial implications were just the beginning. Word traveled fast in Seattle's tight-knit tech community. By lunch, competitors would know about the failed demo. By evening, industry blogs would be speculating about Hexalab's stability. By tomorrow, potential clients would be questioning whether FlowSync was ready for mission-critical deployments. The irony was bitter. FlowSync 3 was genuinely revolutionary. Alira's design work had created the most intuitive project management interface on the market. The development team had built robust functionality that solved real problems for real companies. The product was excellent, but excellence meant nothing if you couldn't demonstrate it when it mattered most. Corvin's phone rang constantly throughout the afternoon. Board members wanting explanations, sales prospects postponing implementation discussions, industry journalists fishing for quotes about the technical difficulties that were already becoming Silicon Valley gossip. Each conversation was a reminder of how quickly success could transform into failure, how a single moment of technical breakdown could undermine months of careful planning and preparation. Corvin had built his reputation on reliability, on delivering results when promised. That reputation was now in serious jeopardy. As the day wore on, the postmortem began. The development team identified the root cause, a database configuration error that had gone undetected during internal testing. It was fixable, preventable, and absolutely devastating in its timing. But Corvin wasn't interested in technical explanations. He was angry, embarrassed, and looking for someone to blame. The careful control he'd maintained over every aspect of his business had failed him at the worst possible moment, and someone was going to pay for that failure. The stage was set for a decision that would prove far more catastrophic than any technical glitch. The aftermath of the failed presentation hung over Hexalabs like a toxic cloud. By 3 p.m., Corvin had endured 6 phone calls from board members, each more pointed than the last. The questions were always the same. How did this happen? Who was responsible? What was the plan to fix it? Corvin didn't have satisfying answers, and that infuriated him more than the technical failure itself. He'd built his entire leadership philosophy on having answers, on being the person who solved problems before they became crises. Now he was scrambling to explain how 18 months of preparation had collapsed in 23 minutes. The development team had gathered in the main conference room, laptops open, diving deep into error logs and system diagnostics. Marcus looked like he might vomit from stress. Senior developer Janet Kim was methodically tracing through code commits from the past week. The atmosphere was tense, focused, and increasingly desperate. "Talk to me," Corvin demanded as he entered the room, his voice carrying an edge that made everyone look up nervously. "We've isolated the issue," Janet reported, her fingers still flying across her keyboard. "Database configuration error in the connection pooling settings. Someone modified the production environment parameters without updating the backup systems." "Someone?" Corvin's voice was dangerously quiet. "I need a name, not a pronoun." The room fell silent. Everyone knew that production changes required approval through a strict protocol. Only senior team members had access to those systems, and every modification was supposed to be logged and reviewed. "The change was made 3 days ago," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible. "But the logs show it was part of a larger optimization package that Alira submitted for the UI performance improvements." Corvin's head snapped toward Marcus. "Alira? She's not even on the back-end team." "No, sir. But she identified some database query inefficiencies that were affecting interface load times. She submitted recommendations through the proper channels, and we implemented them as part of the pre-launch optimization." Janet pulled up the change logs on the main screen. "Here's the submission." Alira flagged several performance bottlenecks and provided specific solutions. The database configuration change was one of her recommendations. Corvin stared at the screen, his anger finding a target. Alira May, the quiet designer who was supposed to focus on user interfaces, had somehow inserted herself into back-end operations and caused the biggest disaster in company history. "Where is she?" he asked. "Probably at her desk," Marcus replied. "She's been working on the post-launch marketing materials." Corvin left the conference room without another word, his footsteps echoing through the office as he made his way to the 32nd floor. Employees looked up from their workstations, sensing the storm approaching but unsure of its target. Alira was exactly where Marcus had predicted, sitting at desk 23B, with her back to the elevator, completely absorbed in her work. Her monitors displayed mock-ups for the FlowSync 3 marketing campaign, elegant graphics showcasing The new features, user testimonials, and promotional materials that would never see the light of day. She was wearing a soft gray sweater and had her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her coffee mug sat half empty beside her keyboard, and Gerald the succulent seemed to be thriving in the afternoon sunlight. It was a scene of peaceful productivity, completely at odds with the chaos consuming the rest of the company. Elira. She turned at the sound of her name, and Corvin was struck by how calm she looked. While everyone else was running around in crisis mode, she appeared completely unaware that anything was wrong. "Oh, hi Corvin," she said with a small smile. "I heard the presentation had some technical issues, but I figured the team would sort it out. I've been working on the marketing rollout for when you're ready to—" "You're fired." The words came out flat, final, without preamble or explanation. Elira blinked, her smile fading as she processed what she'd just heard. "I'm sorry, what?" "You're terminated, effective immediately. Pack your things and leave." The office around them had gone completely silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Keyboards fell quiet. Even the ambient hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause as everyone within earshot tried to process what they were witnessing. Elira's face went through a series of micro-expressions: confusion, hurt, disbelief, before settling into something that looked like resigned understanding. "May I ask why?" she said quietly. "Your database recommendations crashed our investor presentation. 18 months of work down the drain because you decided to play back-end developer." "Corvin, I submitted those recommendations through proper channels 3 days ago. They were reviewed and approved by—" "I don't want to hear excuses. You overstepped your role, caused a system failure, and cost this company millions in potential funding. That's grounds for immediate termination." Elira sat perfectly still for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. Around them, the office remained frozen, everyone pretending not to watch while hanging on every word. "I understand," she said finally. That was it. No argument, no tears, no dramatic scene. Just quiet acceptance that felt somehow more devastating than any emotional outburst would have been. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a small cardboard box, as if she'd been expecting this moment. Into it went her personal items, a photo of her parents, a small notebook, filled with design ideas, a tube of hand cream, and Gerald the succulent. "I'll need your badge and laptop," Corvin said, his voice softer now but still firm. Elira unclipped her security badge and placed it on the desk, then closed her laptop and added it to the pile. She picked up her coffee mug, looked at it for a moment, then set it down beside the laptop. "Someone should water Gerald twice a week," she said, to no one in particular. "He doesn't like direct sunlight, but he needs the window." She stood up, picked up her box, and walked toward the elevator without looking back. Her colleagues watched in stunned silence as she passed their desks. A few started to say something, but the words died in their throats. Just before the elevator doors closed, Elira turned back toward the office. Her eyes found Corvin's across the sea of workstations. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said. Then she was gone. The office remained silent for several long seconds after the elevator doors closed. Then slowly, conversations resumed, keyboards started clicking again, and the normal rhythm of work attempted to reassert itself. But something fundamental had changed. The easy camaraderie that had characterized Hexalabs was gone, replaced by a nervous tension that made everyone glance over their shoulders. If Elira May, beloved, competent, harmless Elira, could be fired without warning or due process, then no one was safe. Corvin returned to his office and closed the door, but he couldn't shake the image of Elira's face in those final moments. Not angry, not bitter, just disappointed. As if she'd expected better from him and was sad to be proven wrong. He tried to focus on damage control, on salvaging what he could from the investor debacle, but his concentration kept drifting back to that moment by the elevator. The way she'd said, "I hope you find what you're looking for," with such genuine sincerity, even after he'd just destroyed her career. What Corvin didn't know, what he wouldn't discover until it was too late, was that Elira's database recommendations had been correct. The performance improvements were exactly what FlowSync needed. The configuration error that crashed the presentation had nothing to do with her suggestions and everything to do with a rushed implementation that ignored her detailed warnings about proper testing protocols. In his anger and desperation to assign blame, Corvin had fired the one person who had tried to prevent the disaster, and that mistake was about to cost him Everything. The morning after Alara's firing, Hexalabs felt like a different company. The usual Friday energy, casual conversations, weekend plans, the relaxed atmosphere that came with surviving. Another week was replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to seep through the office walls. Janet Kim arrived at 7:30 a.m., determined to solve the database issue that had caused yesterday's catastrophe. She'd spent most of the night running diagnostics, and something wasn't adding up. The error logs pointed to a configuration problem, but the more she dug into the code, the more confused she became. At 9:15 a.m., she made a discovery that made her stomach drop. "Marcus, come look at this," she called across the development floor, her voice tight with concern. Marcus hurried over, still looking shell-shocked from yesterday's events. "What did you find?" Janet pointed to her screen, where lines of code and error messages painted a damning picture. "Remember Alira's performance recommendations? The ones that supposedly caused the crash? Yeah, what about them? They weren't implemented correctly. Look at this." Janet pulled up two windows side by side, Alira's original submission and the actual production code. She specifically warned about this exact scenario. Right here, in her notes, critical database connection pooling must be tested in staging environment before production deployment. Failure to follow proper testing protocol could result in system failure during high-traffic events. Marcus leaned closer, reading the documentation that everyone had apparently ignored. In their rush to optimize performance before the investor presentation, oh no. Oh no, no, no. "It gets worse," Janet continued, scrolling through internal emails. She sent 3 follow-up messages asking about testing protocols. The last one was sent at 11:47 p.m. on Tuesday night, 2 days before the presentation. She was working late, trying to make sure everything was properly implemented. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. "We fired her for trying to prevent the exact problem that destroyed our presentation." Word spread quickly through the development team. By lunch, everyone knew the truth. Alira May had been wrongfully terminated for a disaster she'd actually tried to prevent. The woman who'd spent her own time ensuring the company's success had been scapegoated for management's failure to follow proper procedures. The mood in the office shifted from tense to toxic. Conversations happened in hushed tones. People avoided eye contact with management. The easy collaboration that had defined Hexalab's culture was replaced by suspicious glances and careful words. At 2:30 p.m., the first resignation email arrived in Corvin's inbox. "Dear Corvin, after yesterday's events, I can no longer work for a company that treats employees this way. My last day will be March 30th. Tom Chen, Senior Developer." Tom had been with Hexalabs for 2 years, one of the most reliable members of the back-end team. His departure would leave a significant gap in the company's technical capabilities, but, more importantly, it sent a message that reverberated through the entire organization. Day 2. Saturday, March 17th. Weekends at Hexalabs were usually quiet, with only a skeleton crew handling critical maintenance and monitoring. But this Saturday felt different. Corvin found himself in the office at 8 a.m., unable to stay away despite having no specific tasks to complete. The building felt hollow, echoing with the absence of the energy that usually filled these spaces. Alira's desk sat empty, her coffee mug still in the dish rack where she'd left it. Someone had watered Gerald the succulent, but the small plant seemed to droop despite the care. At 10:23 a.m., Corvin's phone buzzed with a notification from Glassdoor, the employment review website. Hexalabs had received its first negative review in over a year. Former employee, UI designer, anonymous pros, good benefits, interesting projects. Cons, management will throw you under the bus without investigation. Witnessed a colleague get fired for trying to prevent a problem that management caused. Toxic leadership that doesn't value employee input. Advice to management: learn to take responsibility for your own mistakes instead of blaming innocent people. The review stung, but it was just the beginning. By noon, 2 more negative reviews had appeared, each one more damaging than the last. The company's overall rating dropped from 4.2 stars to 3.8 stars in a single morning. Corvin tried to focus on damage control, reaching out to the investors who'd witnessed Thursday's disaster. But their responses were polite deflections, the kind of professional courtesy that meant thanks, but no thanks. The funding round was dead, and everyone knew it. Day 3, Sunday, March 18th. Sunday brought no relief. Corvin woke up to find that someone had posted about Elira's firing on LinkedIn, and the post was gaining traction in Seattle's tech community. Witnessed something disturbing this week. A talented designer was fired without cause after a technical failure that she actually tried to prevent. This is exactly the kind of toxic leadership that's destroying our industry. We need to do better. #TechCulture, #leadership, #accountability. The post didn't mention Hexalabs by name, but it didn't need to. Seattle's tech scene was small enough that everyone knew which company had suffered a public presentation failure on Thursday. The comments section filled with similar stories, creating a thread of shared experiences about poor management and workplace injustice. By evening, the post had been shared 47 times and received over 200 comments. Industry professionals were discussing Hexalab's culture, questioning the company's leadership, and sharing their own experiences with toxic management practices. Corvin's phone rang at 7:30 p.m. The caller ID showed Margaret Chen from Cascade Ventures. "Corvin, I hope you don't mind me calling on a Sunday," she began, her tone carefully neutral. "Of course not, Margaret. What can I do for you?" "I've been hearing some concerning things about your company culture. There are rumors about wrongful termination, poor management practices. I wanted to give you a chance to address these concerns directly." Corvin's heart sank. Investors didn't make Sunday evening phone calls to discuss rumors unless those rumors were serious enough to affect their decision-making process. "I'm not sure what you've heard, but I can assure you that Hexalabs maintains the highest standards of—" "Corvin," Margaret interrupted gently, "I've been in this business for 15 years. I know the difference between disgruntled employee complaints and legitimate cultural problems. What I'm hearing suggests the latter." The conversation continued for 23 minutes, with Margaret asking pointed questions about employee retention, management protocols, and decision-making processes. Each question felt like a nail in the coffin of any future relationship with Cascade Ventures. After hanging up, Corvin sat in his empty office, staring out at the Seattle skyline. The city lights twinkled below, representing thousands of other companies. Other leaders who were probably handling crises better than he was. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Janet Kim. I need to talk to you first thing Monday morning. It's about Elira and what really happened with the database issue. We have a serious problem." Monday morning suddenly felt very far away and much too close at the same time. Corvin was beginning to realize that firing Elira May hadn't solved his problems. It had created entirely new ones that threatened to destroy everything he'd built. The weekend that should have been spent celebrating a successful funding round was instead consumed by damage control, reputation management, and the growing realization that his snap decision on Friday afternoon might have been the biggest mistake of his professional career. As Sunday night turned into Monday morning, Corvin found himself thinking about Elira's final words, "I hope you find what you're looking for." At the time, they'd seemed like empty politeness. Now they felt like a prophecy, a challenge to examine what he was actually seeking, and whether his methods were getting him closer to, or further from his goals. The first 3 days after Elira's firing had revealed cracks in Hexalab's foundation that Corvin had never noticed. Employee morale was plummeting, the company's reputation was under attack, and the investors he'd been courting were backing away. The question was no longer whether he could recover from Thursday's presentation disaster, but whether he could survive the aftermath of his own poor judgment. Monday would bring new challenges, new revelations, and the beginning of a reckoning that would force Corvin to confront the difference between being a boss and being a leader. Corvin arrived at the office at 6:15 a.m., hoping to get ahead of whatever crisis Janet Kim needed to discuss. The building felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, less like a thriving tech company, and more like a crime scene waiting to be investigated. Janet was already at her desk, surrounded by printouts, sticky notes, and multiple monitors displaying code repositories and email threads. She looked like she hadn't slept, her usually pristine workspace cluttered, with coffee cups and the detritus of an all-night investigation. "Thank you for coming in early," she said without looking up from her screen. "We need to talk about what really happened last Thursday, and it's not going to be a comfortable conversation." Corvin poured himself coffee from the machine that Elira had once fixed, the irony not lost on him. "What did you find?" Janet turned her monitor toward him, displaying a detailed timeline of events leading up to the presentation disaster. Elira didn't cause the system failure. She tried to prevent it, multiple times. The evidence was damning. Email after email showed Elira raising concerns about the implementation timeline, requesting additional testing phases, and specifically warning about the database configuration issues that ultimately crashed the system. "Look at this one," Janet said, highlighting an email sent at 11:47 p.m. on Tuesday night. She stayed late to run additional tests and found the exact vulnerability that brought us down. She sent this to the entire development team, including management. Corvin read the email, his stomach sinking with each line. "Team, I've identified a critical issue with the database connection pooling in the production environment. The current configuration will fail under high concurrent load, exactly the scenario we'll face during Thursday's presentation. I strongly recommend rolling back to the previous stable configuration until we can properly test the optimization package. This is not a minor bug. This could cause complete system failure at the worst possible moment. Please advise on how to proceed." "Elira, who received this?" Corvin asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Everyone. Development leads, project managers, even copied you on it. But it came in late Tuesday night, and with all the presentation prep happening Wednesday, it got buried in everyone's inbox." Janet pulled up another screen showing email read receipts and response times. 17 people received this warning. 16 of them never opened it. The one person who did open it was Marcus, but he was so overwhelmed with last-minute feature requests that he flagged it for follow-up after the presentation. The timeline painted a clear picture. Elira had identified the problem, warned the appropriate people, and been ignored. Then, when her prediction came true, she'd been fired for the very disaster she'd tried to prevent. "There's more," Janet continued, her voice heavy with regret. "I found her original performance recommendations. They weren't just suggestions, they were comprehensive solutions with detailed implementation guides, testing protocols, and rollback procedures. If we'd followed her instructions exactly, the presentation would have been flawless." Corvin stared at the evidence, feeling the weight of his mistake settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd fired the one person who could have saved the company's biggest moment, and he'd done it publicly, humiliatingly, without investigation or due process. At 9:30 a.m., the situation got worse. Marcus burst into Corvin's office, his face pale and his hands shaking. "We have a problem. A big one." "What now?" "Someone leaked Elira's warning email to TechCrunch. It's going viral." Corvin's blood turned to ice. TechCrunch was the most influential tech publication on the West Coast. If they were running a story about Hexalabs' internal dysfunction, the damage would be catastrophic. The article was already live, titled, "When Warning Signs Are Ignored, a Case Study in Tech Leadership Failure." It featured Elira's email in its entirety, along with expert commentary about the importance of listening to employee concerns and the dangers of scapegoating during crisis situations. The article didn't just report the facts, it analyzed them, drawing broader conclusions about tech industry, culture, management accountability, and the treatment of employees who dare to speak truth to power. Hexalabs was being held up as an example of everything wrong with Silicon Valley leadership. Within hours, the story was picked up by other tech publications. LinkedIn discussions exploded with commentary from industry professionals sharing their own experiences with poor management. Twitter hashtags emerged, #listen to your employees, tech accountability, #Elira May deserved better. By lunch, Corvin's phone was ringing constantly. Reporters wanting statements, clients asking about system stability, potential recruits withdrawing from interview processes. The company's reputation was being destroyed in real time, one social media post at a time. Day 5, Tuesday, March 20th. Tuesday morning brought no relief. The TechCrunch article had been shared over 3,000 times, and copycat stories were appearing on industry blogs across the internet. Hexalabs was becoming a cautionary tale, a symbol of toxic tech leadership that would be studied in business schools for years to come. At 10:15 a.m., Corvin made a decision that surprised even himself. He needed to find Elira May and attempt to make things right, or at least understand how badly he'd damaged both their lives. He'd heard through the office grapevine that she'd been working from Victrola, coffee on Pine Street, freelancing while she figured out her next move. The irony wasn't lost on him. The woman he'd fired was now working from a cafe while he sat in a corner office that felt increasingly like a prison. Victrola was busy with the usual mix of remote workers, students, and creative professionals who made Seattle's coffee culture legendary. Corvin spotted Alira immediately, sitting at a small table near the window with her laptop open and a ceramic mug steaming beside her. She looked different outside the corporate environment, more relaxed, somehow more herself. She wore a soft blue sweater and had her hair down, and she seemed completely absorbed in whatever she was working on. For a moment, Corvin hesitated, wondering if he had any right to intrude on her peace. She looked up as he approached, and her expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been resignation. "Corvin," she said simply, closing her laptop, "I wondered when you might show up." "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. She nodded, and he settled into the seat, suddenly unsure how to begin a conversation that felt both necessary and impossible. "I've been reading about your company in the news," Alira said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "It sounds like things have been challenging." Corvin almost laughed at the understatement. Challenging is one word for it. Catastrophic might be more accurate. They sat in silence for a moment, the ambient noise of the cafe filling the space between them. Corvin found himself studying her face, looking for signs of anger or bitterness, but finding only a calm attentiveness that made him feel even worse about his behavior. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "Actually, I owe you much more than that, but an apology is where I need to start." Alira sipped her coffee, waiting for him to continue. "I was wrong about everything. The database issue, the firing, the way I handled the entire situation. I let my anger and embarrassment cloud my judgment, and I made you pay for my failures." "I know," she said quietly. "You know, I knew the moment you fired me that you were making a mistake, not just about my involvement in the technical issue, but about what kind of leader you wanted to be. I could see it in your eyes. You knew it was wrong even as you were doing it." Her words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He had known, on some level, that he was acting out of emotion rather than logic. He'd violated every principle of good management he'd ever learned, and he'd done it publicly, in front of the entire team. "Why aren't you angry?" he asked. "You have every right to be furious with me." Alira considered the question, looking out the window at the busy street beyond. "I was angry for about an hour. Then I realized that your decision said more about you than it did about me. I know my worth, Corvin. I know the quality of my work and the value I bring to any organization. Your inability to see that doesn't change those facts." Her calm confidence was both inspiring and humbling. Here was a woman who'd been publicly humiliated and wrongfully terminated, and she'd somehow emerged with her dignity intact and her self-worth unshaken. "I don't know how to fix this," Corvin admitted. "The company is falling apart. The team has lost faith in my leadership, and I'm not sure I deserve to get it back." Alira studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether his remorse was genuine or just another calculated business move. "The first step," she said finally, "is admitting that you don't have all the answers. The second step is listening to the people who do." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m., but Corvin knew his fate had already been decided before he walked into the conference room. The past 6 days had been a masterclass in corporate destruction, and the board members' faces reflected the gravity of the situation. Margaret Chen sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable, but her posture suggesting she'd rather be anywhere else. Board Chair Robert Martinez looked like a man attending a funeral, which, in many ways, he was. The other 3 board members avoided eye contact entirely, their attention focused on tablets displaying the latest round of negative press coverage. "Corvin," Robert began without preamble, "we need to discuss the future of Hexalabs and your role in it." The numbers were devastating. In 6 days, the company had lost 3 key employees, seen its Glassdoor rating plummet to 2.8 stars, and watched potential clients postpone or cancel implementation discussions. The TechCrunch article had been viewed over 50,000 times, and the story was being used as a case study in management failure across multiple business publications. "Our legal team has reviewed the termination of Ms. May," Margaret said, consulting her notes. "While technically within your authority as CEO, the circumstances raise serious concerns about due process, investigation protocols, and potential wrongful termination liability. More importantly, added board member Sarah Kim, this incident has revealed fundamental problems with company culture and leadership decision-making that we can no longer ignore. Corvin had prepared for this moment, crafting explanations and justifications that might salvage his position. But sitting in that room, facing the people who'd trusted him to build something meaningful, he realized that defending his actions would only make things worse. "You're right," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "I made a catastrophic error in judgment, and the company is paying the price for my failure." The admission seemed to surprise the board members, who had clearly expected a more defensive response. "The question," Robert continued, "is whether Hexa Labs can recover from this crisis, with you as CEO, or whether we need to consider alternative leadership structures." The conversation that followed was brutal but necessary. Board members outlined their concerns about Corvin's leadership style, his tendency to make unilateral decisions under pressure, and his apparent inability to recognize and value the human elements that made companies successful. "We're not just dealing with a PR crisis," Margaret explained. "We're facing a fundamental breakdown of trust between management and employees. That's not something you can fix with a press release or a company-wide email." At 3:47 p.m., Corvin made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "I want to bring Alira May back as a consultant," he announced. "Not just to fix the technical issues, but to help rebuild the culture I've damaged." The room fell silent. Sarah Kim was the first to speak. "The woman you fired 6 days ago, you want to hire her back?" "I want to ask her to help save the company from my mistakes," Corvin clarified. "She understands both the technical challenges and the cultural problems we're facing. More importantly, she has the respect of the team in a way that I clearly don't." Robert leaned back in his chair, studying Corvin's face. "And you think she'd be willing to work with you after what happened?" "I don't know," Corvin admitted, "but I think it's worth asking. She's the only person who might be able to repair the damage I've caused." The board agreed to give Corvin 48 hours to explore the possibility. If Alira was willing to return in a consulting capacity, they would consider it a first step toward rebuilding company culture. If not, they would begin the process of finding new leadership. Day 7, Thursday, March 22nd. Corvin found Alira at the same table in Victrola Coffee, working on what appeared to be a website redesign for a local nonprofit. She looked up as he approached, and he was struck again by her composure. No trace of bitterness or resentment, just calm professionalism. "Back again?" she said with a slight smile. "This is becoming a habit." "I have a proposition," Corvin said, settling into the chair across from her. "And before you say no, please hear me out." Alira closed her laptop and gave him her full attention. "Hexa Labs is dying," he began. "Not just financially, though that's part of it. The culture, the trust, the collaborative spirit that made us successful, it's all gone. I destroyed it in 30 seconds of poor judgment, and I don't know how to fix it. And you think I do? I think you're the only person who might be able to help. The team respects you, trusts you, believes in your vision. They've lost faith in me, and honestly, I'm not sure they should get it back." Alira sipped her coffee, considering his words. "What exactly are you asking?" "Come back as a consultant. Help us rebuild the technical infrastructure properly this time, but more importantly, help us rebuild the human infrastructure. Show us how to be the kind of company that people actually want to work for." "And what would my role be exactly?" Corvin had spent hours thinking about this conversation, but he realized he didn't have a detailed plan, just a desperate hope that Alira's wisdom could somehow salvage what he'd destroyed. "Whatever you think it should be," he said. "Full autonomy, competitive compensation, and the authority to make whatever changes you think are necessary. I'm not asking you to work for me. I'm asking you to help me learn how to be worthy of working with you." The honesty in his voice seemed to surprise her. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his transformation was genuine or just another calculated business move. "I'll need complete control over the technical implementation," she said finally. "No interference, no second guessing, no management by committee. Done. I'll need the authority to restructure team processes, implement new communication protocols, and establish proper testing procedures. Whatever you think is best. And I'll need a public acknowledgement that my termination was unjustified, along with a formal apology to the entire team. This was the hardest requirement, but also the most necessary. I'll send a company-wide email today, taking full responsibility for my mistakes." Alira was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the Seattle street scene. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but determined. "I'm not doing this for you, Corvin. I'm doing it for the team, for the people who believed in what Hexalabs could be. They deserve better than what happened last week. I understand, and I'm not doing it to save your job or your reputation. If the board decides you're not the right person to lead this company, I won't argue with that decision." "I understand that too." She extended her hand across the table. "Then let's see if we can build something worth saving." The transformation began immediately. Alira returned to Hexalabs that afternoon, not to her old desk but to a conference room that became her temporary command center. She spent the first hour meeting individually with team members, listening to their concerns, understanding the full scope of the damage that had been done. By evening, she'd outlined a comprehensive recovery plan that addressed both technical and cultural issues. The database problems would be fixed within 48 hours using proper testing protocols. The team communication processes would be restructured to ensure that critical information never got lost in email chains again. Most importantly, a new culture of psychological safety would be established, where employees could raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Corvin watched from his office as Alira worked her quiet magic, rebuilding bridges he'd burned and restoring confidence he'd shattered. For the first time in a week, the office felt alive again, filled with the collaborative energy that had made Hexalab special. As Thursday evening turned into Friday morning, Corvin began to understand what Alira had meant when she said he hadn't lost his company, he'd lost his way. The path back wouldn't be easy, and it might not include him in a leadership role. But at least now there was a path. The 7-day collapse was ending, but the real work of rebuilding was just beginning. The first thing Corvin noticed when he returned to the office on Friday morning was the sound. Not the absence of sound, but the return of it. Conversations flowing naturally between cubicles, keyboards clicking. With purpose rather than nervous energy, the occasional laugh that had been missing for over a week. Alira had been back for less than 24 hours, and already the atmosphere felt fundamentally different. He found himself walking through the office more slowly than usual, observing details he'd previously overlooked. The way Marcus was explaining a complex algorithm to a junior developer without the stress lines that had marked his face since the presentation disaster. How Janet Kim was collaborating with the design team instead of working in isolated frustration. The small clusters of employees gathered around whiteboards, sketching solutions and building on each other's ideas. It was then that Corvin realized he'd been seeing his company all wrong. He'd measured success in metrics and milestones, but he'd missed the human connections that made those numbers possible. Watching Alira move through the office, not commanding attention but naturally drawing people into productive conversations, he began to understand the difference between managing and leading. The revelation hit him as he passed the break room and saw her coffee mug. It was still there, exactly where she'd left it 8 days ago. Black ceramic with faded white text, "Design it with heart," or not at all. Someone had washed it and placed it carefully in the dish rack, as if preserving a memorial to better times. Corvin picked up the mug, feeling its weight in his hands. Such a simple object, but it represented everything he'd failed to notice about Alira May. The heart she brought to her work, the care she invested in every project, the way she approached design not as a technical challenge, but as an opportunity to improve people's lives. Standing in that break room, memories began flooding back, moments he'd witnessed but never truly seen. He remembered the day his 6-year-old niece Emma had gotten lost during the company's Family Day event. While other employees politely pointed her toward the reception desk, Alira had knelt down to Emma's eye level, asked about her favorite cartoon character, and walked her hand in hand through the office until they found Corvin. She'd turned a frightening experience into an adventure, complete with a tour of the secret design laboratory where magic pictures were created. He remembered the week when half the development team had been struck by flu, leaving critical deadlines in jeopardy. While Corvin had focused on contingency planning and resource reallocation, Alira had quietly appeared. With homemade soup, throat lozenges, and a willingness to work extra hours covering for sick colleagues. She hadn't asked for overtime pay or recognition. She'd simply done what needed to be done. He remembered the coffee machine incident from 6 months ago. The expensive Italian espresso maker had broken down during a particularly stressful product sprint, and the facilities team couldn't get a repair technician until the following week. Corvin had been prepared to order coffee from the shop downstairs, accepting the inconvenience as a minor cost of doing business. But Alira had spent her lunch break researching the machine's manual online, ordered replacement parts with her own credit card, and fixed the problem herself. When Corvin had offered to reimburse her, she'd waved him off, saying the coffee was better for everyone's productivity. These weren't grand gestures or calculated career moves. They were small acts of kindness that revealed a fundamental truth about Alira's character. She cared about people, not just as resources or team members, but as human beings deserving of consideration and support. Corvin set the mug down carefully and walked to his office, but he couldn't concentrate on emails or financial reports. His mind kept returning to other moments, other instances where Alira's quiet leadership had made Hexalabs a better place to work. The way she'd mentored new hires, not just teaching them technical skills, but helping them navigate office culture and build confidence. How she'd diplomatically handled difficult clients, turning complaints into opportunities for product improvement. The informal feedback sessions she'd organized, creating safe spaces for team members to share concerns and suggestions that might never have reached management through official channels. He thought about her design philosophy, the way she approached every interface, as if real people with real problems would depend on its functionality, while other designers chased aesthetic trends or tried to impress peers with clever animations. Ilara focused on accessibility, usability, and genuine user benefit. Her work wasn't just beautiful, it was compassionate. The irony was overwhelming. Corvin had built his leadership style around data and objectivity, believing that emotions were inefficient distractions from optimal performance. But Alira had proven that the most valuable business metric wasn't profit margin or user acquisition cost. It was the human element that made sustainable success possible. He remembered a conversation from her first week at Hexalabs when she'd asked about the company's mission statement. Corvin had recited the official language about leveraging technology to optimize enterprise productivity, but Alira had looked puzzled. "But what does that mean for the people who use our software?" she'd asked. "How do we make their work lives better, not just more efficient?" At the time, Corvin had dismissed the question as naive idealism. Now he understood it was the most sophisticated business insight anyone had ever offered him. Watching Alira work over the past day, he'd seen how she approached every interaction with genuine curiosity about other people's perspectives. She didn't just listen to respond, she listened to understand. She asked questions that revealed hidden assumptions and challenged conventional thinking. She created environments where people felt safe to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to propose unconventional solutions. This was leadership in its purest form, not commanding from authority, but inspiring through example. Not demanding compliance, but earning trust through consistent demonstration of values. Not managing people like resources, but recognizing them as complex individuals with unique strengths, fears, and motivations. Corvin realized that his attraction to Alira wasn't just professional admiration, it was something deeper, more personal. He was drawn to her authenticity, her ability to remain true to her values even under pressure, the way she'd handled her wrongful termination with grace rather than bitterness. How she'd returned to help rebuild what he'd destroyed, not for personal gain, but because she believed in the potential of what Hexalabs could become. For the first time in his adult life, Corvin found himself wanting to be worthy of someone else's respect, not just their compliance. Alira's approach to rebuilding Hexalabs was unlike anything Corvin had witnessed in his years of corporate leadership. She didn't issue directives or implement sweeping policy changes. Instead, she began with conversations, quiet, one-on-one discussions that felt more like therapy sessions than business meetings. Her temporary office was a converted conference room on the 32nd floor, deliberately chosen to be accessible to all team members without the intimidation factor of executive territory. She'd arranged the furniture in a circle rather than the traditional desk and chairs setup, creating an environment that encouraged collaboration rather than hierarchy. On her first full day back, Alira scheduled individual meetings with Every employee who'd been affected by the previous week's chaos. Not performance reviews or damage assessments, but genuine check-ins about how people were feeling, what they needed to move forward, and what changes would help them do their best work. Marcus was her first appointment at 9 a.m. He entered the room looking like a man expecting punishment, his shoulders hunched and his eyes avoiding direct contact. Alira gestured to one of the comfortable chairs and poured him coffee from a thermal carafe she'd brought from home. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice carrying none of the corporate formality that usually characterized workplace conversations. "I'm okay," Marcus replied automatically, then caught himself. "Actually, no, I'm not okay. I feel terrible about what happened to you, and I keep thinking I could have prevented it if I just read your emails sooner." Alira leaned forward slightly, her expression compassionate but not pitying. "Marcus, you were dealing with an impossible workload and unrealistic deadlines. The fact that critical information got lost in the chaos isn't your fault. It's a system failure, not a personal one." "But you should have been supported better," Alira interrupted gently. "You should have had clear priorities, reasonable timelines, and a communication structure that ensured important warnings didn't get buried in email overload. That's what we're going to fix." The conversation continued for 45 minutes, with Alira asking thoughtful questions about Marcus's work processes, stress levels, and ideas for improvement. She took detailed notes, not about his performance, but about the systemic issues that had created an environment where good people made preventable mistakes. By the time Marcus left, his posture had straightened, and his voice carried a confidence that had been missing since the presentation disaster. He'd been heard, understood, and valued, not just as a developer, but as a human being whose well-being mattered. Janet Kim's session at 10:30 a.m. followed a similar pattern. As the senior developer who discovered the truth about Alira's warnings, Janet carried a heavy burden of guilt about not speaking up sooner. "I knew something was wrong with how you were treated," Janet confessed. "But I was scared to challenge Corvin's decision. I thought it might make things worse for everyone." Alira nodded thoughtfully. "Fear of retaliation is a real concern in many workplaces. The fact that you felt unsafe speaking truth to power tells us something important about the culture we need to change. How do we fix that? We create systems that protect people who raise difficult truths. We establish clear protocols for challenging decisions. Most importantly, we model the behavior we want to see, starting with leadership that admits mistakes and values dissenting opinions." Throughout the day, similar conversations unfolded. Tom Chen, who'd submitted his resignation, agreed to stay after Alira assured him that his concerns about workplace justice were being taken seriously. Sarah from accounting shared her observations about declining team morale and offered suggestions for improving cross-departmental communication. Each conversation revealed another piece of the puzzle that was Hexalab's cultural breakdown. Employees felt disconnected from leadership, uncertain about job security, and hesitant to share ideas that might be perceived as criticism. The company had become a place where people kept their heads down and followed orders, rather than a collaborative environment where innovation could flourish. But Alira didn't just identify problems. She began implementing solutions immediately. She established psychological safety circles, small groups where team members could discuss challenges without fear of judgment or retaliation. She created anonymous feedback channels that bypassed traditional management hierarchies. She instituted failure parties, monthly meetings where teams could share mistakes they'd made and lessons they'd learned, transforming errors from sources of shame into opportunities for growth. Most importantly, she modeled the vulnerability she wanted to see from others. During the all-hands meeting on Friday afternoon, Alira stood before the assembled team and shared her own experience of the previous week. She talked about the hurt she'd felt when fired without explanation, the anger that had briefly consumed her, and the decision to return not for revenge, but for restoration. "I'm not here because I'm perfect," she told the group. "I'm here because I believe in what we can build together. I've made mistakes, I'll make more mistakes, and I need all of you to feel safe calling me out when I do." The response was immediate and powerful. Questions that had been suppressed for months began flowing freely. Suggestions that had been dismissed as not my job were suddenly welcomed as valuable insights. The artificial barriers between departments started dissolving, as people realized they were all working toward the same goals. Elira's technical leadership was equally transformative. She didn't just fix the database issues that had caused the presentation disaster. She redesigned the entire development process to prevent similar failures. She implemented automated testing protocols, established clear code review procedures, and created documentation standards that ensured knowledge wasn't trapped in individual minds. But her greatest innovation was the integration of empathy into technical decision-making. Every feature request was evaluated not just for technical feasibility, but for human impact. User experience wasn't an afterthought. It was the primary consideration driving all development choices. She organized cross-functional teams that included developers, designers, customer, service representatives, and even end users in the decision-making process. This collaborative approach slowed down some development cycles initially, but it resulted in products that actually solved real problems rather than creating new ones. Watching Elira work, Corvin began to understand that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about creating environments where the best answers could emerge from collective wisdom. She didn't lead through authority or intimidation, but through inspiration and inclusion. Her grace under pressure was remarkable. When frustrated team members vented about past grievances, she listened without defensiveness. When clients expressed concerns about company stability, she acknowledged their fears while outlining concrete steps being taken to address them. When board members questioned her methods, she provided evidence-based explanations without arrogance or condescension. By the end of her first week back, Hexa Labs felt like a completely different company, not because the fundamental business had changed, but because the human relationships that powered that business had been healed and strengthened. 2 weeks after Elira's return, Corvin found himself staying late in the office, not because of crisis management or damage control, but because he genuinely enjoyed being there again. The building hummed with productive energy, the kind that came from people who believed in their work and trusted their colleagues. It was 7:30 p.m. on a Thursday when he noticed the lights still on in Elira's temporary office. Through the glass walls, he could see her reviewing what appeared to be architectural plans for a redesigned workspace layout. She'd been working with facilities to create more collaborative spaces, areas where spontaneous conversations could flourish alongside focused individual work. He knocked softly on the doorframe. "Mind if I come in?" Elira looked up from her drawings, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Of course. I was just finishing up the plans for the new team collaboration zones." Corvin entered and took the seat across from her, the same arrangement they'd maintained during their cafe conversations. But this time, the dynamic felt different, less like supplicant and savior, more like equals working toward a common goal. "I wanted to thank you," he began, then stopped himself. "Actually, that's not quite right. I've thanked you multiple times, and words feel inadequate for what you've accomplished here." Elira set down her pencil and gave him her full attention. "What did you want to say?" "I wanted to tell you that I'm learning to see things differently, not just about business or leadership, but about what actually matters." He gestured toward the office beyond the glass walls. 3 weeks ago, I thought I understood success, revenue growth, market share, operational efficiency. But watching you work, seeing how you've transformed not just our processes, but our entire culture, I realize I was measuring the wrong things. What are you measuring now? Corvin considered the question carefully. How people feel when they come to work, whether they trust each other enough to share difficult truths, if they believe their contributions matter beyond just hitting quarterly targets. He paused. Whether they can be fully human in a professional environment. Elira smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he'd seen from her since her return. "Those are much better metrics." "I have a confession," Corvin continued, his voice softer now. "I've been thinking about you a lot, not just professionally but personally, and I'm trying to figure out if what I'm feeling is gratitude, admiration, or something deeper." The honesty in his voice seemed to surprise her. She leaned back in her chair, studying his face with the same careful attention she brought to user experience research. "What do you think it is?" "I think I'm falling in love with who you are," he said simply. "Not just your competence or your grace under pressure, but your fundamental approach to being human. The way you see people as whole individuals rather than just their professional functions. How you lead through service rather than authority. The fact that you came back here not for revenge or personal gain, but because you believed in what we could become together." Alira was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the desk surface. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful but cautious. "Corvin, 3 weeks ago, you fired me without investigation or due process. You made a decision based on anger and embarrassment that could have destroyed my career. I need to understand that you've genuinely changed, not just learned to say the right words. How can I prove that to you?" "You can't prove it," she said gently. "Change isn't something you demonstrate once, it's something you live consistently over time. What I can tell you is that I've seen glimpses of the person you're becoming, and that person is someone I could respect, trust, and potentially care about." Corvin felt a flutter of hope mixed with the sobering reality of her words. What would that look like? Us exploring whatever this is between us? Alira stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. The city lights reflected off the glass, creating a double image that seemed to mirror the complexity of their situation. "It would look like taking things slowly," she said, "building a foundation of trust and mutual respect before we consider anything romantic. It would mean you continuing to grow as a leader and as a person, not because you want to win me over, but because it's who you genuinely want to become." She turned back to face him. "And it would mean me learning to see you as Corvin the person, not just Corvin the CEO who made a terrible mistake." Corvin stood and joined her at the window, careful to maintain respectful distance while still feeling the magnetic pull of her presence. "I want to be worthy of that chance," he said. "Not just with you, but with everyone whose trust I've damaged. I want to build something here that we can all be proud of." "Then let's build it together," Alira replied. "As colleagues first, as friends hopefully, and as whatever else might develop naturally over time." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the city pulse with life below them. Finally, Corvin reached out tentatively, and Alira allowed their hands to touch, not a romantic gesture, but an acknowledgement of partnership, of shared commitment to something larger than either of them individually. "I have one more confession," Corvin said, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "I kept your coffee mug, the one from the break room. I couldn't bring myself to put it away." Alira laughed, a sound that filled the office with warmth. "Design it with heart, or not at all. That's the one. I finally understand what it means. It means that everything we create, products, companies, relationships, should be infused with genuine care for the people it affects. It means choosing empathy over efficiency, connection over control, service over self-interest. Will you teach me how to do that?" "I think," Alira said, squeezing his hand gently, "we'll teach each other." As they gathered their things and prepared to leave the office together, Corvin realized that this moment marked more than just the beginning of a potential relationship. It represented a fundamental shift in how he understood leadership, success, and what it meant to build something truly valuable. The man who had fired Alira May in a moment of panic and pride was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the greatest strength came from vulnerability, that the best leaders were those who served others, and that love, whether romantic, platonic, or professional, was always built on a foundation of trust, respect, and genuine care for another person's well-being. Walking out into the Seattle night, their hands linked in tentative partnership, both Corvin and Alira knew they were embarking on something new, not just a relationship, but a way of being in the world that honored both professional excellence and human connection. 6 months after the presentation disaster that nearly destroyed Hexa Labs, Corvin stood in the same conference room where his world had collapsed, but everything felt different. The mahogany table was the same, the view of Seattle's skyline unchanged, but the energy in the room crackled with genuine excitement rather than desperate hope. Margaret Chen from Cascade Ventures sat across from him, but this time, her expression radiated enthusiasm instead of skeptical politeness. David Rodriguez from Summit Capital was actively taking notes, asking detailed questions about implementation timelines and market expansion strategies. Jennifer Walsh, who had declined to even respond to emails 6 months earlier, was now discussing partnership opportunities and long-term investment commitments. "The transformation is remarkable," Margaret said, reviewing the latest quarterly reports. "Not just the financial metrics, though those are impressive. It's the cultural indicators that really stand out. Employee satisfaction scores, retention rates, innovation pipeline, everything suggests a company that's found its sustainable growth rhythm. The numbers told an extraordinary story of recovery and renewal. Hexa Labs had not only regained its pre-crisis valuation but exceeded it by 37%. FlowSync 3, properly tested and flawlessly implemented, was gaining market share faster than any competitor. Customer satisfaction ratings had reached all-time highs, driven by user experience, improvements that prioritized human needs over technical complexity. But the most significant changes weren't visible in spreadsheets or financial projections. They lived in the daily interactions between team members, the collaborative energy that filled every floor of the Columbia center offices, and the sense of shared purpose that had replaced the fear-based compliance of the previous culture. The office layout itself reflected this transformation. Gone were the isolated workstations and hierarchical arrangements that had characterized Corvin's original design. In their place, Illyra had created flexible collaboration zones, quiet focus areas, and communal spaces that encouraged both productivity and human connection. The break room had been expanded into a proper cafe area, where employees gathered not just for coffee but for informal brainstorming sessions and cross-departmental problem-solving. Employee turnover had dropped to nearly zero, while applications for open positions had increased by over 200%. Industry publications that had once used Hexa Labs as a cautionary tale about toxic leadership were now featuring the company as a case study in successful cultural transformation. Harvard Business School had even requested permission to develop a curriculum module based on the company's recovery process. The technical improvements were equally impressive. Illyra's systematic approach to development processes had eliminated the kind of critical failures that had plagued the original investor presentation. Automated testing protocols caught potential issues before they reached production environments. Clear communication channels ensured that important warnings never got lost in email overload. Most importantly, a culture of psychological safety meant that team members felt empowered to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Customer feedback reflected these internal improvements. FlowSync users consistently praised not just the software's functionality, but its intuitive design and accessibility features. The platform had become genuinely helpful, rather than merely efficient, solving real problems for real people in ways that improved their daily work experiences. "We're prepared to move forward with the Series B funding round," David Rodriguez announced, his words carrying the weight of validation that Corvin had desperately sought 6 months earlier. "The due diligence process has been exceptional, and we're confident in both the product roadmap and the leadership team's ability to execute." The irony wasn't lost on Corvin. The funding he'd nearly destroyed through poor judgment was now being offered freely, based on the very changes that had initially seemed like admissions of failure. By acknowledging his mistakes, embracing vulnerability, and prioritizing human relationships over pure efficiency, he'd created the kind of sustainable success that investors actually wanted to support. The relationship between Corvin and Illyra had evolved with the same careful intentionality that characterized their professional collaboration. What began as tentative partnership had gradually deepened into genuine friendship, built on shared values and mutual respect, rather than workplace proximity or romantic attraction alone. Their first official date hadn't happened until 4 months after Illyra's return to Hexa Labs. Corvin had asked her to dinner at Canlis, one of Seattle's most prestigious restaurants, but Illyra had countered with a suggestion that revealed her character, volunteering together at a local food bank, followed by coffee at the same Pine Street cafe where they'd had their crucial conversations. "I want to see how you interact with people who can't do anything for your career," she'd explained with characteristic directness. "That tells me more about who you really are than any fancy restaurant could." The evening had been revelatory. Watching Corvin work alongside homeless individuals and struggling families, Illyra saw genuine compassion that went beyond calculated corporate social responsibility. He listened to their stories without judgment, treated everyone with equal dignity, and seemed genuinely moved by the opportunity to contribute to something larger than business success. "You're different than I expected," she'd told him over coffee afterward. "Different how?" "More human. Less performative. I can see the person you're becoming, not just the CEO you've always been." Their relationship had progressed through small moments of increasing intimacy. Shared lunches where they discussed philosophy and values rather than quarterly projections. Weekend walks through Pike Place Market, where Corvin learned to appreciate the artistry in everyday interactions between vendors and customers. Evening conversations in Alira's apartment, surrounded by her design sketches, and the succulents she'd rescued from various office environments. The physical attraction had always been present, but it was built on a foundation of intellectual and emotional connection that made every touch meaningful. When Corvin finally kissed her, 6 weeks after their first date, it felt like the natural culmination of months of growing trust rather than a conquest or achievement. "I love who you've become," Alira whispered against his lips that night, her words carrying weight that went far beyond romantic sentiment. "I love who you've helped me become," he replied, understanding that his transformation wasn't complete, but was genuine and ongoing. Their relationship became a model for the kind of partnership that was possible when two people committed to bringing out the best in each other. They challenged each other professionally, supported each other personally, and maintained individual identities while building something together that was stronger than either could achieve alone. At work, they were careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, but there, colleagues could see the positive influence they had on each other. Corvin's leadership style continued evolving toward greater empathy and collaboration. Alira's confidence grew as she took on more strategic responsibilities, eventually accepting the title of Chief Experience Officer, a role that encompassed both user experience design and organizational culture development. Their love story wasn't the dramatic, all-consuming romance of Hollywood movies. It was something more sustainable and ultimately more powerful, a partnership between two people who had learned to value character over charisma, growth over perfection, and service over self-interest. 6 months after that first tentative hand touch in the office, they were planning not just a future together, but a shared vision for what Hexalabs could become. A company that proved business success and human flourishing weren't mutually exclusive goals. Standing together in the conference room after the successful investor meeting, their hands intertwined beneath the table, both Corvin and Alira understood that they'd built something rare, a love that made them better individually while creating value for everyone around them. As our story draws to a close, it's worth reflecting on the profound lessons that emerged from Corvin Slate's week of reckoning and the months of rebuilding that followed. These aren't abstract business principles or motivational platitudes. They're hard-won insights that cost a man his pride, nearly destroyed his company, and ultimately transformed both his professional and personal life. The first lesson is perhaps the most difficult for successful people to accept. Humility isn't weakness, it's the foundation of sustainable leadership. Corvin's initial success had been built on confidence, decisiveness, and an unwavering belief in his own judgment. But true leadership requires the courage to admit mistakes, the wisdom to seek input from others, and the strength to change course when evidence contradicts your assumptions. The moment Corvin stopped defending his ego and started examining his actions, he began the journey toward becoming the leader his company actually needed. The second lesson challenges our cultural obsession with loud, charismatic leadership. Quiet strength often accomplishes more than dramatic authority. Alira May never raised her voice, never demanded attention, never used her position to settle scores or advance personal agendas. Yet her influence transformed an entire organization because she understood that lasting change comes through consistent example, not forceful mandate. The people who hold teams together are often the ones working steadily in the background, solving problems before they become crises and supporting others without seeking recognition. The third lesson speaks to the heart of human relationships. Love, whether romantic, platonic, or professional, grows best in environments of psychological safety and mutual respect. Corvin's attraction to Alira wasn't based on conquest or convenience, but on genuine admiration for her character and values. Their relationship succeeded because it was built on a foundation of trust, earned through consistent behavior over time. This principle applies equally to workplace relationships, friendships, and family dynamics. The fourth lesson addresses the true nature of redemption. Owning your mistakes doesn't erase their consequences, but it opens the possibility for genuine healing and growth. Corvin couldn't undo the damage caused by his poor judgment, but he could take responsibility for it and commit to becoming someone worthy of a second chance. Redemption isn't about forgiveness. It's about transformation. Before you click away from this story, I want you to do something important. Please hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear these lessons. More importantly, drop a comment below and tell me about a time when your pride cost you something valuable, or when someone's quiet strength made a difference in your life. Your story might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear today. The final lesson is the most personal. Success without human connection is ultimately hollow, but success that lifts others up creates a legacy worth leaving. Corvin learned that the metrics that matter most can't be measured in quarterly reports. They live in the relationships you build, the people you develop, and the positive impact you have on others' lives. As you navigate your own leadership challenges, remember Corvin and Alira's story. Ask yourself, are you leading through fear or through service? Are you building walls or bridges? Are you measuring what's easy to count or what actually counts? The choice, as always, is yours. But choose wisely, because the people around you are watching, learning, and deciding whether you're someone worth following or someone they need to survive. What will your story teach the people whose lives you touch?